Less than a year since moving its longest-running weekly show to Netflix, WWE is upending the pro wrestling media landscape once more. This Saturday evening, WE's WrestlePalooza PLE will be the first event of its kind to be broadcast live on ESPN, as part of a 5-year deal worth $1.6 billion. It might be a first for WWE, as we'll no doubt hear over and over again from the commentary team this weekend, but it isn't entirely new ground for ESPN. The network previously aired pro wrestling events back in the 1980s and 90s, a fact that has been somewhat swept under the rug in the decades since. Most significantly, ESPN was the broadcast partner of Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, AWA, between 1985 and 1990. Unlike WWE's deal, it wasn't exactly a major milestone for the broadcaster, but it did have a big impact on AWA. With a national television slot, Gagne's promotion could strengthen its credentials as America's third national pro wrestling show, behind WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions (JCP). That suited ESPN, which was looking to capitalize on the wrestling craze in the 80s that had caught the network off guard. With WWF and JCP doing strong numbers on USA Network and WTBS, respectively, ESPN sent word to the various wrestling territories, still reeling from WWF's departure from the National Wrestling Alliance, that it was in the market for a partner. Various promotions got their chance to submit tapes to ESPN, including Bill Watts, Mid-South Wrestling. But it was AWA that won the beauty pageant. Supposedly, the fact that Gagne's promotion had Sergeant Slaughter on the roster was the decisive factor, with ESPN executives recognizing his name from his previous run within the WWF. Slaughter wasn't the most famous wrestler associated with AWA, but he did have one big advantage over some of the others, in that he was at least still working for Gagne. By the time of the ESPN deal, the AWA had already lost its superstar performer, Hulk Hogan, to the WWF. Some of the promotion's other big names, including Jesse Ventura and Mean Gene Okerlund, followed the Hulkster shortly after. In their absence, Gagne was left with a thinning roster, some of whom were well into their 50s, some old hands, like the Crusher, were already technically senior citizens. But among them were a handful of rising stars, including the likes of Curt Hennig, Scott Hall, Big Van Vader and the Road Warriors, all of whom appeared on the AWA's ESPN shows. The AWA was a less polished product than its bigger competitors. But ask wrestling aficionados and former tape traders and you'll find suggestions of matches that deserve to be recognized as being every bit as good as anything coming from Vince McMahon. Curt Hennig vs. Nick Bockwinkel on New Year's Eve 1986 is often cited as one of the best AWA matches to make tape, says Andrew Lutsky, a longtime fan of the AWA and occasional wrestling writer. The 50-something world champion Bockwinkel attempts to fend off his young and hungry #1 contender for nearly an hour. At one point, Bockwinkel is asking the ref how much longer there is to go, all while dripping in blood. Not that blood was totally unexpected on an AWA show. Lutsky recalls Jimmy Snuka vs. Larry Zybszko from earlier that same year. It's my favorite ESPN match, but largely for the aftermath, he says. Colonel De Beers shoves Snuka from the top rope to the cement floor. Snuka then ends up taking several face-first piledriver-type moves, leaving him a bloody mess on the floor. Despite delivering respectable viewing figures, pro wrestling wasn't always treated brilliantly by ESPN. The AWA's weekly slot on Tuesday afternoons would often be moved around in order to make space elsewhere in the schedule. Then there were the pot shots from ESPN's regular announcers, who would joke about the promotion's amateur production values, presumably for the benefit of more conventional sports fans. By the end of the 1980s, it wasn't just sportscasters who weren't impressed by the AWA's offering. Another tranche of Gagne's better performers had been poached by the WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions, leaving the shows dependent on a revolving door of lesser-known wrestlers. By 1988, live audiences at tapings had dwindled significantly, giving the ESPN shows a reputation for eerily silent auditoriums. In a desperate attempt to revive the AWA's fortunes, Gagne announced the infamous Team Challenge Series, a confusing tournament with novelty stipulations played largely for laughs. Unsurprisingly, comedy matches like The Great American Turkey Hunt failed to pry viewers away from the WWF. By the fall of 1990, AWA's ESPN contract was cancelled. ESPN then turned to the Dallas-based Global Wrestling Federation, GWF, founded in 1991 by two ex-territory employees. Unfortunately, the show proved to be even less successful than its predecessor, the worst wrestling show ever or just one of them? Asks one lively Reddit discussion from a few years ago. Though it did feature early appearances from future WWF luminaries like Mick Foley, John Bradshaw Layfield and Booker T. When GWF closed its doors in '94, ESPN's flirtation with pro wrestling looked to have been put to bed. Though both promotions would later have their old tapes revived for ESPN Classic, AWA's old shows were broadcast as recently as 2013. Then in the mid-2010s came the next big shift. The rise of social media, and the transformation of broadcasters into multi-platform media companies, gave ESPN another way to cash in on pro wrestling's relative popularity, this time by focusing on the biggest promotion of them all, WWE. In 2015, ESPN announced that former WWE announcer Jonathan Coachman, who had jumped ship to ESPN almost a decade earlier, would begin covering pro wrestling on SportsCenter. It was a big change from the network's typical stance toward WWE, and not one that passed without controversy.